I was working the front desk at a hostel in Melbourne when an American backpacker checked in and immediately launched into what he thought was an Australian accent. "Day mate, throw another shrimp on the barbie, eh?" He winked at me like we were sharing an inside joke. I stared at him. "We don't say shrimp. We say prawns. And that is Canadian. And nobody actually says that phrase unless they're mocking tourists." He continued, completely confident. "I've been practicing my Aussie for months. My roommate in Colorado said I sound just like Crocodile Dundee. I told him that movie came out in 1986. He said, 'Exactly, a classic. That's how I learned authentic Australian.' He pronounced authentic like authentic with a strange emphasis that hurt my ears. He kept the accent going for his entire 3-night stay, getting progressively worse each day. A woman walked into my cafe in Sydney and ordered her flat white by saying flat white, but pronouncing each word separately and loudly, like she was teaching me English. When I confirmed her order in my normal Australian accent, she lit up. "Oh my God, your accent is so strong. Say something Australian for me." I asked her what she wanted me to say. She thought for a moment, then requested, "Say, put another shrimp on the barbie." I explained that we don't actually say that, and we call them prawns. She looked disappointed and said, "But that's like the Australian phrase. My dad says it every time he grills." She then attempted her own accent. "Crikey mate, let's go walkabout in the outback." She pronounced crikey like crikey instead of crikey. Every word was wrong. She asked if she sounded Australian. I told her she sounded like she was having a stroke. She laughed and said that's what her boyfriend tells her too. I was giving a walking tour in Brisbane when an American tourist interrupted my explanation of the city's history to ask if I could talk more Australian. I asked what that meant. He said, "You know, like really lay it on thick. The accent." I explained I was using my normal speaking voice. He seemed genuinely confused and said Americans had told him Australians have super thick accents like in the movies. He then demonstrated what he thought was an Australian accent by saying Aussie, 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 oi 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 while doing a strange hunched over stance. I informed him that's a sporting chant, not how we talk. He insisted his uncle visited Australia in 1994 and that's how everyone spoke. When I explained language evolves and his uncle might be misremembering, he said, "Nah mate, pronouncing mate like mate instead of mot, I know what I'm talking about." I watched both Crocodile Dundee movies twice. He spent the rest of the tour speaking in his version of Australian, which sounded more like a drunk Englishman attempting a South African accent. Other tourists started avoiding him. I work at a university in Perth, and an American exchange student approached me speaking in what she believed was an Australian accent. It was aggressively wrong, every vowel distorted beyond recognition. She was asking about enrollment, but it took me 3 attempts to understand her because she kept saying enrollment with a bizarre inflection. When I responded in my regular voice, she stopped and said, "Wait, why don't you have an accent?" I explained I very much have an Australian accent, she's just American so it sounds neutral to her. She rejected this completely. "No, I mean like a real Australian accent. Like the Hemsworth brothers." I pointed out the Hemsworth brothers are actually Australian and have real Australian accents. She said, "Yeah, but they make it sound cool and obvious. You just sound normal." She then asked if I was from a part of Australia that doesn't have the accent yet. I asked her to clarify what she meant by that. She explained that maybe Perth was too isolated to develop the full Australian sound. She'd been in the country for 6 hours. A guest at my hotel in Cairns asked if I could teach him a few Aussie phrases before he went out for the night. I suggested "no worries" as a common one. He repeated it back as "nah worries" with a strange emphasis on the second word that made it sound like a disease. I gently corrected him. He tried again, "Nour worries." Worse somehow. He then asked for the really Australian stuff, like how to say throw another shrimp on the barbie. I explained again that we say prawns and nobody actually says that. He laughed and said, "Come on mate, don't hold out on me. I know you guys say it all the time. It's like your national motto or something." I told him our national motto is actually in Latin. He looked confused and asked why we'd have a Latin motto if we speak Australian. When I explained we speak English, just with an Australian accent, he said that didn't make sense because Australian and English are totally different. He went to the pub that night and apparently introduced himself to several locals using his practiced phrases. The bartender called me to come get him after he asked someone to throw a shrimp on his barbie, and they thought he was propositioning them. I was working at a bottle shop in Adelaide when an American asked where the Foster's was. I pointed him toward the imported beer section, explaining that Australians don't actually drink Foster's. He didn't believe me. "But it's Australian for beer, right? That's what the commercials say." I told him those are American commercials and Foster's is basically only sold overseas. He insisted I was wrong because he'd done his research by watching Australian tourism videos on YouTube. He then asked, in his attempted accent, "Where's the VB, mato? Mato isn't a word. Nobody says that." He continued, "I'm here to drink like a true blue Aussie, crikey-dingo mate." Each word was pronounced with a different, incorrect emphasis. When I just stared at him, he asked if his accent was too good and if I couldn't understand him because he sounded too local. I sold him a 6-pack of Victoria Bitter and watched him photograph it with a caption about authentic Australian culture. He took a sip and immediately made a face. Asked if we had Bud Light. I work at a surf shop in Byron Bay, and an American tourist came in asking for a boogie board in what he thought was an Australian accent. The accent made boogie sound like boogie with a guttural sound I'd never heard from a human throat. When I showed him our bodyboards, he corrected me. "Nah mate, I need a boogie board. For the waves, yeah." He did a hang loose gesture. I explained boogie board and bodyboard are the same thing. He said that couldn't be right because his Australian friend from online definitely said boogie board, and Australians know best. I asked where his friend was from. "Melbourne, I think, or Sydney. One of those." He then started using what he believed was Australian slang. "I'm gonna shoot the tubes and get barreled, no wuckas." I'd never heard anyone say no wuckas before. I asked if he meant no wuckers or no worries. He insisted wuckas was how the locals say it because he'd heard it in a viral video. When I said I'd lived here my entire life and never heard that, he suggested maybe I lived in a non-coastal part of Byron Bay. Byron Bay is literally on the coast. He could see the ocean from where we stood. A customer at my bookstore in Hobart asked if we had any books about Australian language because she wanted to learn to speak Australian properly. I showed her some books about Australian English and slang. She flipped through one and seemed disappointed. "This is just English words. Where's the Australian translation?" I explained Australian is English, just with different slang and pronunciation. She refused to accept this. "But when Australians talk, I can't understand them, so it must be a different language." I suggested that's just accent and dialect. She pulled out her phone and showed me a list she'd made titled Australian to English translation, and it was beautifully, completely wrong. Arvo equals afternoon. I knew that one. But what's a bottle-o? I explained it's a liquor store. She wrote that down, pronouncing it bodlo instead of bottle-o. She continued down her list. "What's a servo? What's a Uda? What's brekkie?" I answered each one. Servo is gas station, Uda is pickup truck, brekkie is breakfast. She seemed upset that they were just short versions of English words and not real Australian words. She asked if there were any phrases that were completely Australian, not just English. I suggested, She'll be right. She wrote it down, then asked how to spell she'll. She'd been spelling it shell this whole time. I drive for Uber in Melbourne, and I picked up an American who immediately started speaking to me in his version of an Australian accent. How you going, cobber? Bonza day, innit? Nobody under 70 says cobber. Nobody says bonza anymore except ironically. And innit is British. I politely told him he could speak normally. He said he wanted to practice his Australian because he was going deep into the outback tomorrow. I asked where specifically. The outback. You know, the desert part. I explained the outback is massive and covers most of the country. He said he was going to Phillip Island to see penguins. Phillip Island is 140 kilometers from Melbourne and is absolutely not the outback. When I corrected him, he said, well, it's outside Melbourne, so that's outback. I explained that's not how geography works. He disagreed. Outback just means outside the city, right? Like outback. He then asked if I'd ever seen a kangaroo fight a dingo in my backyard outback. I told him I live in an apartment. He seemed personally disappointed, like I'd failed him as an Australian. For the rest of the ride, he practiced phrases. Day Bruce. Throw another shrimp on the Barbie. That's not a knife, this is a knife. Every single one was from movies. When I dropped him off, he tipped me in American dollars and said, cheers, mate, while doing finger guns. I work at a pharmacy in Newcastle, and an American asked for medicinal Vegemite, while attempting an accent that made him sound like he had a head cold. I asked what medicinal Vegemite was. He explained that his Australian coworker back in Texas told him Vegemite has health benefits and Australians use it for everything. Like, you guys put it on burns and stuff, right? I explained that's not remotely true. Vegemite is just a yeast spread for toast. He looked skeptical and said his coworker was a real Australian from Canberra who knows what he's talking about. He then asked if we had any Tim Tams with pain reliever in them. I asked why he thought that would exist. Because Tim Tams are Australian and medicine is Australian, so there must be medical Tim Tams. His logic was completely linear and completely wrong. I showed him regular Tim Tams in the snack aisle. He bought 3 packets and asked if eating them would help his jet lag. I told him no. He ate an entire packet in front of me and said, I feel better already. You Aussies are onto something. The placebo effect was strong with this one. I was working security at the Sydney Opera House when an American family approached for their tour. The father immediately addressed me in an accent that can only be described as offensively Australian. Day mate, we're here to see the Opera House. It's a ripper, innit? His entire family looked mortified. I welcomed them normally, and he stopped me. Wait, can you say that again but more Australian? My wife wants to record it for Facebook. I repeated my greeting in the exact same voice. He looked confused. No, like, do the accent. The Aussie voice. I explained this was my normal voice and I was Australian. He turned to his wife and said, Honey, I don't think he's a real Australian. His accent isn't strong enough. His wife apologized to me while their teenage daughter stared at the ground, willing herself to disappear. The father then asked if there was someone more Australian he could take a photo with. I told him I was born in Sydney and had lived here for 34 years. He said, Yeah, but have you ever wrestled a crocodile? When I said no, he asked, Then how Australian are you really? He spent the entire tour speaking in his attempted accent, saying things like stone the crows and fair dinkum in completely wrong contexts. He used fair dinkum to mean hello, goodbye, and at one point as a response when asked if he wanted to buy a souvenir. At the gift shop, he asked the cashier if they had anything with Steve Irwin on it that proves I'm basically Australian now. They did not. He bought a boomerang and immediately tried to throw it inside the building. I had to confiscate it. Americans will watch one episode of a cooking show with an Australian host and decide they've mastered the accent. They'll practice, no worries, in the mirror until it sounds like a threat. They'll add mate to the end of every sentence like punctuation. And they'll be absolutely convinced they sound exactly like a local, despite sounding like they're having a medical emergency. And somewhere right now, another American is confidently explaining to a bewildered Australian that they're pronouncing their own accent wrong.